You're nothing like us. My mother said it the way other mothers say I love you, easy, often. Smiling, with a little tilt of her head, like she was doing me a kindness by reminding me. For 30 years, my family called me the one who didn't belong, and my 2 older sisters learned to laugh on cue every single time she said it. I set the table. I drove my grandmother to church. I was the outsider who kept showing up anyway. So when I mailed everyone one of those ancestry kits before the reunion, a keepsake, I called it, something sentimental for my father's 65th birthday, nobody thought twice. My sisters spit in the little tubes and posted about it. My mother rolled her eyes and said it was a waste of $40. Nobody but me knew why I really sent them. At that reunion, someone's results got passed hand to hand down the long table, phone screen glowing between the water glasses. My father put on his reading glasses. He looked at the screen, and the color drained out of his face until he was the same gray as the tablecloth. Then he stood up, and he asked every single person in that room to step outside. Every person but me. If you're still with me, do me a small favor and hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't. Because this story took me 30 years to be able to tell, and I want to know I'm not saying it into an empty room. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I like to picture the kitchens and the cars and the late-night headphones this reaches. My name is Camille Thornton. I'm 33 years old and I'm a genetic counselor, which is going to matter more than you think, because it turns out the thing my family spent 3 decades mocking me for, being careful, being precise, being the one who reads the fine print, was the exact thing that let me see what everyone else at that table refused to. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why my father went gray and why he sent his own wife and his 2 favorite daughters out onto the lawn while he kept me inside, you need to understand how I grew up. So let me take you back. Not 30 years. I'll spare you the diaper stories. Let me take you back to the last reunion. The one 4 years before this one. The one where I first learned to keep my mouth shut and my eyes open. We're the Thorntons. If you drove past our house, you'd think we had it all figured out. My father, Gerald, built a regional supply company from a single truck into something with his name on the side of 40 of them. My mother, Patricia, ran the house and the calendar, and I would come to learn a great deal more than that. And then there were the daughters, 3 of us, on paper. Vivian, the eldest, 38, all cheekbones and confidence, the one who could walk into any room and rearrange it around herself. Danielle, 36, softer, prettier in the way magazines like, the peacemaker who never actually made peace so much as she smoothed things over so the same fight could happen again next holiday. And me, the one who didn't belong. I want to be careful here, because I know how these stories go, and I don't want you thinking I was some tragic little match girl with her nose pressed to the glass. I had a good life in a lot of ways. I had my grandmother, I had books, I had, eventually, a career I loved. What I didn't have was a single family photograph where my mother's hand rested on my shoulder the way it rested on my sister's. Let me show you what I mean instead of just telling you, because telling you is easy and it doesn't land. That reunion 4 years ago, my mother had a photographer come, a real one, with lights and a reflector, out in the backyard under the big oak. She lined us up, and I watched her physically arrange her daughters. She stepped to Vivian and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She stepped to Danielle and adjusted her collar and murmured something that made Danielle laugh. Then she got to me. She stopped. She looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture that doesn't match the room you just redecorated. And she said to the photographer, not to me, "Can we maybe put her on the end? She photographs so differently from my girls." My girls. I was standing right there. I was one of the girls. I would later find out, the only one at that shoot who was actually, biologically, 100% her daughter and my father's daughter both. And she put me on the end and called the other 2 hers. I smiled for the picture. I have it somewhere. You can see it in my eyes if you know to look. That specific stillness you learn when you've decided that reacting will cost you more than swallowing it. I was 29. I had already learned that lesson 1,000 times. Now here's the thing I need you to hold on to because it's the whole engine of everything that came after. I didn't hate my family. That would have been simpler. I loved them. I kept showing up to the reunions and the birthdays and the Sunday dinners specifically because I kept believing that this year would be the year I finally did something impressive enough, warm enough, useful enough, that my mother would look at me the way she looked at Vivian. I was a grown woman with a master's degree, and part of me was still that little girl setting the table perfectly, hoping someone would notice how straight I'd lined up the forks. The only person who ever noticed was Nana Ruth. Nana Ruth is my father's mother. She was 84 that summer, sharp as a tack and twice as pointed, and she lived in a small brick house across town that smelled like coffee and old paper. She was the one fixed star in my whole childhood. When my mother would say I was nothing like them, Nana Ruth would look up from her crossword and say, "No, she's not. Thank God." At that reunion 4 years ago after the photograph, after everyone had drifted to the food, Nana found me standing alone by the drinks table, doing that thing I do where I organize the cups by size so I have something to do with my hands. She came up beside me. She didn't say anything for a while. She just watched my mother across the yard, laughing with Vivian, one hand on Vivian's back. Then Nana said something I didn't understand for 4 more years. She said, "You know, you've got more of your father in you than either of those two will ever have. And it's got nothing to do with the way you set a table." I laughed it off. I thought she meant I was stubborn or careful or that I had his nose. I said, "Thanks, Nana," and I refilled her lemonade. She caught my wrist. Her hand was thin and cool and stronger than it looked. She looked at me with those pale eyes that had watched this family for 6 decades, and she said, quieter, "One of these days somebody's going to have to look at this family with clear eyes, and it's going to have to be you, because you're the only one who isn't lying to herself." And then she let go and asked me to bring her a plate, and just like that, she was an old woman at a party again. I want you to sit in that moment with me for a second, because I didn't. I filed it away as Nana being Nana, cryptic and a little bitter about her daughter-in-law, and I brought her a plate with extra deviled eggs, and I went back to being invisible. I had no idea she'd just handed me the first thread of the thing that would unravel all of us. I had no idea that 4 years later, I'd be standing in that same yard, holding a single sheet of printed paper, finally understanding exactly what she meant. I want to give you one more picture from before, because I need you to understand that being the outsider in my family was not one big dramatic thing. It was 1,000 small ones, so small that if I'd ever tried to complain about a single one out loud, I'd have sounded insane. That's how it works. That's how they get you to doubt your own eyes. I was maybe 10. It was Christmas. My mother had a tradition. The girls each got an ornament every year, a special one, engraved, and every Christmas Eve we'd hang them and she'd tell the little story of each one. Vivian's were gold, Danielle's were silver. Beautiful things, kept in tissue paper the rest of the year. And every year I'd wait because I was 10 and I still believed waiting worked for her to hand me mine. That year I finally asked. I said, "Mom, where's my ornament?" And the room went quiet in that particular way, and my mother looked at me with something like patient exhaustion, and she said, "Oh, sweetheart, you never seemed like you cared about that kind of thing. You're not really a sentimental girl, not like the girls." And Danielle, the soft one, the peacemaker, Danielle laughed, not cruelly. That's the thing you have to understand. She laughed the way you laugh to agree with your mother, to stay on the warm side of the room, and she said, "Yeah, Cammie, you'd probably just lose it anyway." And everyone smiled, and my mother went back to the story of Vivian's gold snowflake, and I understood that I had just been handed the reason I didn't get a thing, and the reason was me. I made myself a rule that night, 10 years old, sitting on the stairs, don't want things out loud, because wanting them out loud was how they found the soft place to press. And I kept that rule for 23 more years. I stopped asking for the ornament. I stopped asking for the hand on the shoulder. I stopped asking, and they called it not being sentimental, not caring about family, being different. And every year, the not caring they invented for me got written a little deeper into the family story until it was so solid that 18 months before that reunion, a lawyer could put it in a trust document and no one would blink. Here's what I know now that I didn't know at 10. I was the most sentimental one in that house. I'm the one who kept every card. I'm the one who drove Nana to church. I'm the one who, 30 years later, cried over a number on a screen because some little part of me had still been hoping we were all really the same. The story that I didn't care wasn't a description. It was a tool, built early, sharpened yearly, and pointed at exactly one thing, making sure that when the money moved, the daughter who actually belonged would be the one everyone had already agreed didn't. So, when I tell you my mother fought a spit test like her life depended on it, I need you to understand it wasn't paranoia. She'd spent 30 years building something, and somewhere underneath, she must have always known it was made of paper, and that paper burns. But before any of that, before the kits, before the trust, before my father went gray at the head of the table, there was one more thing that had to happen first. A thing that happened 7 years ago in a hospital that I misfiled in my own head for far too long. Because the first person who ever handed me a piece of this puzzle wasn't Nana Ruth. It was a lab. 7 years ago, my father got sick. It started as tired. Gerald Thornton did not get tired. This was a man who drove his own trucks in a snowstorm at 60 because he didn't trust anyone else to. So when he started falling asleep in his recliner at 4 in the afternoon, when his skin took on a yellow cast under the kitchen lights, my mother finally dragged him to a doctor, and the doctor sent him to another doctor. And by the end of that month, the word kidneys was being said in a low voice in a lot of rooms. He needed a transplant, or he was heading toward needing one, fast. And when a family member needs an organ, the first thing that happens is everybody gets tested. Blood type, tissue typing, the whole workup to see who might be a match, who might be able to give a piece of themselves to keep him alive. Now, I need to explain something about my job because this is the hinge the whole story swings on. And I want you to actually understand it and not just take my word for it. I'm a genetic counselor. I spend my days sitting across from frightened people, translating the language of blood and cells into plain English. I read reports full of numbers most people never see and never need to. Blood types, tissue markers, the little inheritance patterns that pass down from parent to child as reliably as gravity. There are rules to it. Hard rules. A parent with one blood type cannot, no matter what, produce a child with certain other blood types. It's not opinion. It's not a vibe. It's arithmetic written in a language older than any of us. So we all got tested that fall 7 years ago. Me, my mother, Vivian, and Danielle, all of us lined up to maybe save Dad. And I, being me, being the careful one, being the one who reads the fine print, I asked for copies of the results, not to snoop. I told myself it was so I could help the family understand what the doctors were saying. My mother thought it was morbid. Only you, she said, would want to collect everybody's blood type like baseball cards. Vivian didn't even open hers. I opened all of them, at my kitchen table alone on a Tuesday night with a cup of tea going cold beside me. And something was wrong, not with mine. Mine slotted into my parents' results exactly the way a daughter's should. I was, by every marker on that page, the biological child of Gerald and Patricia Thornton. Clean. Textbook. It was Vivian's that stopped me, and then Danielle's. I read them 3 times. I got out a pen. I drew the little grid I'd drawn 1,000 times for other families, the one that shows which parent can pass what to which child. And the numbers on my sister's pages would not fit inside that grid. Not with my father as their father. There was a marker there. I won't bore you with the exact letters, but it's the kind of thing that is simply not possible to inherit from a man who does not carry it. And my father did not carry it. It was right there, on his own page. I sat in my kitchen and I felt the floor tilt. I told myself I was tired. I told myself labs make errors, samples get switched. I'd seen it happen. I told myself 100 reasonable things because the alternative was a sentence I could not make myself finish. My sisters, the real daughters, the ones my mother's hand always rested on, could not both be my father's biological children. And here is the part I'm least proud of, the part I've turned over in my head 1,000 times since. I did nothing. I want to be honest with you because if I dress this up, you won't trust the rest. I didn't do nothing because I was noble. I did nothing because I was afraid, and because I was tired, and because some small, ugly part of me was afraid of what it would make me if I went looking. My father was sick. He needed peace, not a bomb. And underneath even that, I'll say it, there was a voice that whispered, "If this is true, then you're the only real one." And I was so frightened of how much I wanted that to be true that I shoved the whole thing in a drawer in my mind and locked it. He got better, by the way. It didn't come to a transplant in the end. His numbers stabilized on medication and a diet my mother enforced like a warden. The tests got filed. The crisis passed. Everyone exhaled and forgot. I didn't forget. I just stopped looking. For 7 years, I carried that grid folded up in the back of my mind, and every reunion, every time my mother said, "You're nothing like us," a small, cold voice would answer her from somewhere I didn't let myself go. "No, Mother, I'm the only one who is." So, now you know 2 things nobody else at that table knew. You know what Nana Ruth said to me by the drinks, and you know what I saw at my kitchen table 7 years ago. Hold both of those because this next part is where I finally stopped locking things in drawers. It was this past spring, April. My father's 65th birthday was coming up in July, and my mother had decided it would be the reunion to end all reunions. A whole weekend, the extended family, cousins flying in, a tent on the lawn. And she put Vivian in charge of the theme, and Danielle in charge of the food, and me in charge of nothing, which was standard. I decided to give myself a job. I'd been reading for work about the boom in those consumer ancestry kits, the spit-in-a-tube ones, the ones that tell you you're 23% Irish and related to a stranger in Ohio. They'd gotten cheap, and there was a trend I kept seeing, families doing them together, turning the results into a whole sentimental activity at reunions. A grandmother crying over a map of where her people came from. It was everywhere. And I thought, with a part of my mind I was still pretending was innocent, wouldn't that be a nice thing to give everyone? A keepsake. For Dad's 65th, a little map of the family where we all came from. I want to be truthful about the layers of what I was feeling because I've had a lot of time to sit with it. On the surface, it really was a sweet idea, and part of me really did mean it that way. But underneath the sweet idea was that folded grid from 7 years ago. And underneath that was Nana Ruth's voice, "Somebody's going to have to look at this family with clear eyes." I ordered 9 kits, 1 for each of us, 1 for Nana, and a few for the cousins who'd want in. I paid for all of them myself, the full price my mother would have called a waste. And I mailed them out in April with a cheerful little card that said, "Let's find out where we come from. Love, Camille." I told myself I didn't know what they'd show. That was a lie. I knew exactly what they might show. What I didn't know, what I could not have known, sitting at my kitchen table sealing those envelopes, was that I had just started a clock, and that on the other side of the family, someone else heard it start ticking and began very quietly to try to run it out before it could ring. The kits went out in April. The first strange thing happened within a week. My mother called me. Now, my mother did not call me. My mother texted me logistics. Bring a folding table, pick up your grandmother. Don't wear that color. A phone call from Patricia Thornton was an event. So when her name lit up my phone on a Wednesday evening, I actually stood up from my couch, the way you stand when the doorbell rings unexpectedly. "This ancestry thing," she said. "No hello. I don't think it's appropriate." I asked her what she meant. She said it was tacky. She said it was the kind of thing that felt like an invasion. digging around in people's blood, and that some things in a family were private, and that she'd already thrown hers in the trash and she thought the girls should too. I remember standing very still in my living room, because here's what you have to understand. My mother did not care about privacy. My mother posted our entire lives online. My mother had opinions about tacky. Sure, but tacky to her meant paper napkins, not learning where your ancestors were born. There was something underneath her voice that I had never heard before, not in 30 years of being told I didn't belong. She was scared. I didn't say that, of course. I said, "It's just a fun keepsake for Dad, Mom. Vivian already did hers." And that was true. Vivian, who never met a camera she didn't like, had already spit in the tube and posted it. And I heard my mother go quiet on the other end, and then she said in a tight little voice, "Well, I think it's a mistake." And she hung up. I sat back down. My tea was cold again. I have a lot of cold tea in this story. And the folded grid in the back of my mind, the one from 7 years ago, unfolded itself one corner. Over the next few weeks, my mother waged a quiet little war against a spit test. She lost hers twice, and I had to send replacements. She told Danielle it gave her a bad feeling, and Danielle, ever the smoother over, let her sit unopened on her counter for a month. Only Vivian's had actually gone in because Vivian couldn't resist an audience. And once Vivian's was in the system, my mother's whole campaign had a strange desperation to it, like someone trying to close a door after one person had already walked through. I want to be clear about my own state of mind here, because I don't want you thinking I was some cold operator running a scheme. I wasn't. Most nights, I convinced myself I was making a mountain out of a lab error from 7 years ago. Most nights, I told myself my mother was just being controlling, which she always was. I went to work. I saw my clients. I helped a young couple understand a test result about their unborn son, and I held the young wife's hand while she cried, and I thought, this is who I am. I help people face the truth gently. And then I'd drive home and see my mother's missed call and feel that cold voice again. And then, in May, Nana Ruth asked me for help with her papers, and that changed everything. Nana was 88 by then, still sharp, still living in the brick house that smelled of coffee, but her eyes were going and the mail had started to pile up in a way that worried me. So I started going over on Sunday afternoons to help her sort it. Bills, mostly, insurance, the endless paper avalanche that falls on old people in this country. She'd sit in her chair with her tea. Hers was always hot. She scolded me for letting mine go cold. And she'd direct me and I'd file. One Sunday, she sent me to the back bedroom, to the old oak desk that had been my grandfather's, to find a homeowner's insurance document. And in the bottom drawer, under the insurance, I found a folder. It was labeled in my grandfather's handwriting, faded, and then updated in a lawyer's crisp type. It said Thornton Family Trust. I should have just brought Nana the insurance and closed the drawer. Some part of me knew that. But I'm the one who reads the fine print. It's the thing they mocked me for. So I opened it. I need to slow down here, because this is where the ground I'd been standing on for 33 years actually broke. My grandfather, my father's father, Nana's late husband, had been a careful man, too. Turns out that's where I got it. Decades ago, he'd set up a family trust. The bulk of the family's real wealth wasn't in my father's company at all. It was in this trust, land, and holdings my grandfather had built, meant to pass down through the bloodline, down through his son Gerald, and then down to Gerald's children, his grandchildren, by blood. And there, clipped to the front of the folder, was an amendment, recent, dated 18 months ago. I read it standing up in that back bedroom with the afternoon light coming through the lace curtains, and I read it 4 times, the way I'd read the lab results 7 years before. The amendment restructured the distribution of the trust. It named Vivian. It named Danielle. It laid out in careful legal language how the holdings would pass to them, generous and specific. My name was not in it. Not as a lesser share. Not as a token. Not at all. Where a third daughter should have been, there was nothing. As if I had never been born. And at the bottom, in the section explaining the change, there was a line. A single line in the dry voice of the law, summarizing the reason the family had given for the restructuring. It said the third daughter had chosen a separate path and shown little connection to the family's affairs. Chosen a separate path. Little connection. I stood in my grandmother's back bedroom, 33 years old, holding the legal, notarized version of "You're Nothing Like Us." They hadn't just said it at reunions to make my sisters laugh. They had written it down. They had taken it to a lawyer. They had turned 3 decades of making me feel like a stranger into the official reason to treat me like one. And I understood, standing there, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that this had never been about my personality. Nobody makes a child feel like an outsider for 30 years by accident, and then just happens to have the legal paperwork ready to make it real. This was built. This was a structure someone had been raising, brick by brick, since before I could remember. The mockery wasn't the wound. The mockery was the tool. I heard Nana call from the front room, asking if I'd found the insurance. I looked at that amendment, and I looked at the drawer, and for one long second, I did the math on my whole life. Then I put the insurance document on top, and I slid the trust folder into my bag, and I walked back out to my grandmother with my face perfectly still. Because I'd had 30 years of practice keeping my face still. And because I finally understood what she'd meant by the drinks table 4 years ago. Somebody's going to have to look at this family with clear eyes. I sat down across from her. She looked at me over her hot tea with those pale eyes, and she said, "You found it, didn't you?" It wasn't a question about the insurance. I said, "Nana, how long have you known?" And she set down her cup and she told me. Nana Ruth did not tell me everything that Sunday. She was too careful for that and too kind. But she told me enough to turn every light on in a house I'd been walking through in the dark my whole life. She told me that a long time ago, before I was born, there had been a bad stretch in my parents' marriage, that my father had thrown himself into building the company and left my mother alone with a big house and a lot of time, that there had been a man, Nana said the word man the way you'd handle something hot, a friend of the family, someone who came around and then stopped coming around all at once, the way people do when a thing has to end. Nana said she never knew for certain, but she said she'd held Vivian as a newborn, and then 2 years later she'd held Danielle, and both times she'd looked down at the baby and then up at her son, and something in her chest had gone quiet and cold, and she'd never been able to explain it even to herself. And then, she said, you came along. And her old face did something I'd only seen it do a handful of times. It softened all the way through. And I held you, and I looked at you, and I looked at Gerald, and my chest didn't go cold. For the first time, it went warm. Because there he was. There was my son, looking back up at me out of a baby's face. She reached across and put her thin hand over mine. You are the only one of those 3 I ever held and knew. And your mother has hated you for it since the day you were born. I don't remember crying, but my face was wet, so I must have. Why the trust? I asked. Why cut me out? If anything, I couldn't finish it. Because you're the only one who is, Nana said simply. Think it through, Camille. You always could. That money was your grandfather's, and he tied it to blood on purpose because he was old-fashioned and he wanted it to go down the line. If the truth ever came out, you'd be the only grandchild with any claim to it at all. The other 2 would have none. So the safest thing, the only thing, was to make sure everyone believed you were the one who didn't belong. Get it written down. Get it notarized. Make you the stranger before anyone could ever suspect the strangers were the other 2. She squeezed my hand. She didn't build that wall around you because you were different, child. She built it because you were dangerous. You were the proof. I want to stop here for just a second, because I know some of you are already 3 steps ahead and furious, and I want to say something to you directly. If you have ever been the family scapegoat, the difficult one, the sensitive one, the one who just doesn't fit, I want you to hear this, and then I want you to hold on to it while I tell you the rest. Sometimes the thing they punish you for is not a flaw. Sometimes it's a fact they can't afford for anyone to see. So do me a favor. In the comments, tell me, were you the one who didn't belong? What was the thing they said made you different? I read every one of these, and I promise you, you were never the thing they said you were. Now let me tell you what I did about it, because I did not sit in my grandmother's living room and stay a victim. I got to work. Here is what I did not do. I did not drive to my mother's house and scream. I did not call my sisters. I did not post anything, hint at anything, or confront anyone. I had 30 years of evidence that reacting cost me more than it ever gained. And more than that, I'm a genetic counselor. My entire professional life is built on one principle. You do not deliver a life-changing truth on a hunch. You confirm it. You bring the numbers. You make it so solid that no one, not even the person who most wants to deny it, can argue with the paper in front of them. So I decided to bring the numbers, all of them. The trust folder was already in my bag with Nana's blessing. She was, after all, still living, still a trustee, and she signed a paper that afternoon in her shaky hand, giving me the authority to review the family's records on her behalf. That mattered. I want to be clear, I didn't steal anything or hack anything. An 88-year-old woman with every legal right to those documents asked her granddaughter to help her understand her own affairs. That's all it ever was. On paper. On paper is where I live. The DNA was already coming. Vivian's kit was in the system. Mine would go in next. I'd been holding my own tube, if I'm honest, half afraid to send it. Now I sent it. And I started, gently, working on the others, because a family map needs the whole family. I told the cousins it would mean so much to Dad. I reminded Danielle. I did not push my mother. I already knew what her resistance meant, and her sample was not the one I needed. And then there was the money. Because a lie that big is never just a lie about blood. Blood was the why. But I'd learned enough in one afternoon to know there had to be a how, and the how would be in the accounts. Over the next 6 weeks, sitting at Nana's oak desk on Sunday afternoons with her authorization in my hand, I did what I do. I read the fine print, years of it, and a pattern came up out of those pages the way a photograph comes up in a darkroom. Slow, and then all at once. There were payments, regular ones, going back further than I wanted to believe. Out of accounts my father assumed his wife was managing responsibly, tuition that hadn't gone where it was said to go, a property tax on a house that, when I looked, my parents didn't own. But someone did. Someone whose name, when I finally found it on a deed, made Nana go very quiet when I said it out loud. Money moving, year after year, quietly, expertly, from the man who earned it toward the family he never knew wasn't entirely his. My mother hadn't just lied. She'd been running the house and running the money and running all of us for 30 years. And every dollar that flowed toward Vivian and Danielle was a dollar steered by a woman making sure her secret stayed funded and buried. I sat at that desk with a spreadsheet I'd built. Because of course I built a spreadsheet, because I'm the careful one, because that's the thing they mocked. And I looked at the total at the bottom, and I understood that I was no longer holding a sad family story about a daughter who didn't fit, I was holding a case. And the reunion was 5 weeks away. 5 weeks out, my mother came for me. Not literally. My mother never did anything literally. She worked in weather. But I felt the pressure drop the way you do before a storm. It started with Vivian calling me. Vivian, who called me even less than my mother did, to ask, all casual, why I was spending so much time at Nana's. Someone had noticed the Sunday afternoons. Then Danielle texted a picture of the reunion invitation and mentioned, oh, so lightly, that Mom was thinking of simplifying the weekend, maybe cutting some of the extra activities. And did I still really want to do the whole DNA thing? Because honestly, it was stressing everyone out. Cutting the activity, 5 weeks before it would have paid off. My mother had figured out that she couldn't unring the bell one kid at a time, so she was going to try to cancel the whole ceremony where the bell would ring loudest. I want to describe the dinner because this is the scene where I understood I was in an actual fight, and that my opponent had 30 years more practice at it than I did. My mother invited me over to talk about the reunion. Just the two of us, she said, which had happened maybe twice in my adult life. I went. I sat at her kitchen table, the same table where I'd never once felt like I belonged. And she made tea, and hers was hot, and she set mine down in front of me, and I watched it start to go cold out of pure habit. She was good, I'll give her that. She didn't accuse me of anything because to accuse me, she'd have had to name the thing, and naming it was the one thing she could never do. So instead, she circled. She told me she'd been thinking, and that maybe I'd been right that the family had never made me feel included, and that she wanted to fix that. She reached across the table and put her hand on mine, her hand on me for maybe the third time in my life. And she said she thought the DNA activity had been such a thoughtful idea, but that it was bringing up old feelings for people. And wouldn't it be a more beautiful gesture, more mature, if I were the one to gently call it off, to be the bigger person, to show everyone I'd grown past needing that kind of attention. She was offering me in that moment the exact thing I had wanted for 30 years. Her hand on mine, her approval, her telling me I was the mature one, the good one, the bigger person. All I had to do to get it was bury the one thing that would ever set me free. I looked at her hand on mine. I thought about the photograph and the end of the line and my girls. I thought about a line in a legal document, chosen a separate path. I thought about Nana's chest going cold over a newborn and warm over me. And I smiled and I said, "You know what, Mom? You're right. It has been stirring things up." And I watched relief flood her face, 30 years of vigilance loosening for just a second. And then I said, "Let me think about the best way to handle it. I don't want to disappoint Dad. He's so excited to see where the family comes from." And I turned my hand over under hers and gave it one squeeze, and I let her believe she'd won. Here's what I need you to understand about that squeeze. It was not surrender. It was the coldest, most deliberate thing I have ever done, because I finally understood the rules of the game she'd been playing my whole life. And the first rule was, never let her see you coming. She had 30 years of watching me react, so I gave her the reaction she wanted, and underneath the table, in my other hand, I was already holding the plan she'd never see. I drove home that night and I did not cry. I sat in my car in my driveway and I made 2 phone calls. The first was to the Ancestry Company to confirm that results, once processed, were delivered directly to each individual's own account and email, that my mother could not, no matter what she told people at the reunion, reach into the system and stop what was already in it. They confirmed it. Vivian's were already processing. Mine were in the lab. The second call I'll get to. It matters, but it belongs later. The results started coming back the 3rd week of June. Mine came first. I opened it alone, at my kitchen table at night, with a cup of tea I did not let go, cold this time. I drank it, all of it, hot, because Nana had scolded me about that my whole life, and I finally understood she'd been trying to teach me to stop bracing for bad news. I clicked through the pretty graphics, the map, the little percentages, and then I got to the part they don't put on the map, the relatives, the section where the system quietly compares your DNA to everyone else in it and tells you, in cold, clean numbers, exactly how you're related. And there was Vivian. The system had us both. And where it should have said full sibling, where 2 daughters of the same 2 parents would show a specific, unmistakable amount of shared DNA, it said something else. It said half the shared DNA, the exact signature of 2 people who share one parent and not the other. One parent, our mother, not our father. I sat with that number for a long time. I had suspected it for 7 years. I had reasoned my way to it in my head 100 times. But suspecting a thing and seeing it rendered in a number, a machine, produced without any feelings at all, are 2 entirely different experiences. And I want to be honest that my first feeling was not triumph. It was grief. Because somewhere under all of it, some little girl part of me had still been hoping the lab had made a mistake 7 years ago, that we really were all the same, that I could have belonged after all. The number closed that door, gently, permanently, in clean digital type. And then, sitting there, I felt something else rise up underneath the grief, something I'd been swallowing for 3 decades. And for once, I did not swallow it. Not rage. Something steadier than rage. It was the feeling of a thing finally being true out loud, even if the only one who could hear it yet was me. I printed it, 1 page. The relatives section, Vivian and me, half, in black and white. I put it in a folder with the trust amendment and the spreadsheet with the number at the bottom. 3 documents. That's all it was in the end. A number about blood, a number about money, and a piece of paper that had erased me. The reunion was 8 days away, and I finally knew exactly what I was going to do with them. 8 days, I used them, because a number that says half tells you the what, but it doesn't tell you the who, and I am the kind of person who needs the whole picture before she walks into a room. That name on the deed, the house my parents didn't own but had somehow been paying taxes on for years, had been sitting in my spreadsheet like a locked door. So in those last 8 days, in the evenings after work, I opened it. It wasn't hard, in the end. Property records in this country are public if you know where to look, and I know where to look. It's practically the family trade now. The house was 2 towns over. The name on the deed was a man's, and when I ran it back through the years, through old newspaper archives and a business registry, a shape came together. He'd been a supplier decades ago. A man who'd done business with my father's company in its early days, back when it was still a few trucks. A man who, the records showed, had stopped doing business with my father abruptly around the year Vivian was born and had done very well for himself in the years since. Well enough, it seemed, to live in a house that my father's money quietly helped carry. He died 4 years ago. I found his obituary, and I sat at my kitchen table and read it. This stranger who was, if the blood was right, the biological father of the 2 sisters who'd spent their lives laughing at me. And I felt the last piece rotate into place. He'd had no other children of his own, the obituary said. Survived by no one. Survived by 2, I thought. They just don't know it yet. I want to tell you about the near miss, because it's the moment the whole thing almost came apart 8 days before the finish line, and because it taught me the last thing I needed to know about my mother. That Sunday, the last Sunday before the reunion, I was at Nana's, at the oak desk, printing the final version of the spreadsheet. Nana was dozing in her chair in the front room, and I heard a car in the driveway. I looked out through the lace curtains, and it was my mother's car. She never came to Nana's. In 30 years, I could count her visits on one hand. But there she was, coming up the walk with a covered dish in her hands, the picture of a devoted daughter-in-law, and I understood in a cold flash exactly why. Vivian had told her about my Sunday afternoons. My mother had finally decided to come see for herself what her strange, careful youngest daughter was doing in the one house in the family where she couldn't control the story. I had the trust folder open on the desk, the spreadsheet in the printer tray, everything. I did not panic. I want you to hear that because 30 years earlier, the little girl setting the table would have frozen. Instead, I moved. I slid the folder into my bag. I took the warm pages from the printer and folded them into my waistband under my shirt, which is a thing I never in my life imagined I'd do. I closed the desk drawer, and by the time my mother let herself in the front door with her covered dish and her bright, watching eyes, I was sitting in the chair across from a sleeping Nana with a magazine open in my lap, my heart slamming, my face doing the still, blank thing it had done my whole life. The thing she'd taught me to do, turned around and used against her at last. "Camille," she said, and I watched her scan the room, the desk, the printer, me. What a surprise. "What are you doing all the way out here?" "Helping Nana with her mail," I said. Easy, true. "Somebody has to. What are you doing here, Mom?" Something flickered across her face. She hadn't expected me to ask her back. "I made a casserole," she said, holding up the dish like evidence. "For your grandmother. I worry about her out here alone." which was a lie so bald that Nana, who had woken up and was watching us both through half-closed eyes with the patience of a cat, let out a small sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a cough. My mother stayed 45 minutes. She poked around. She asked Nana how the papers were coming, whether everything was in order, whether I'd been getting into anything I shouldn't. And Nana, God bless her, played frail and vague and a little deaf, and told her daughter-in-law that Camille was a good girl who helped her sort the electric bill. And wasn't it nice? And would Patricia like to see her crossword? My mother did not want to see the crossword. She left the casserole no one would eat, and she left, and I watched her car back down the driveway with both hands aching from how hard I'd been holding still. When she was gone, Nana opened her eyes all the way. "She knows something's coming," she said. "She can smell it. She always could." Then she looked at the corner of the spreadsheet sticking out from under my shirt, and her old mouth curved. "You'd better keep those closer than that, girl. 8 days is a long time for a frightened woman to do damage." I kept them closer than that. I didn't leave the documents at Nana's again. I didn't leave them anywhere. For the last 8 days, those 3 pages lived in a folder in a bag that did not leave my side. And I understood finally that the reason my mother had ruled us all for 30 years was not that she was strong. It was that no one had ever made her afraid. And now, for the first time, she was. She could smell the truth coming and she couldn't find it, couldn't get ahead of it, couldn't arrange it. For 8 days, the most powerful person in my family drove around with a casserole, looking for a bomb she couldn't locate, and never once thought to look inside her own past. Because that's the thing about a secret you've kept for 30 years. You get so good at guarding the door that you forget the truth was never locked in a room. It was in the blood the whole time, and the blood was already in the mail. The second phone call, the one I said I'd get to. That week, I called a lawyer, an estate attorney, a stranger, someone with no connection to my family at all, and I paid for an hour of her time, and I laid the whole thing out. The trust, the bloodline language my grandfather wrote, the amendment, and the number that said half. I didn't do it to build a weapon. I did it because I have spent my whole career watching people blow up their own lives by delivering a truth they didn't fully understand, and I was not going to walk into that reunion running on feelings. I was going to walk in knowing exactly what was true and exactly what wasn't. What she told me was simple, and it settled something in me. She said the amendment could be challenged, yes. But that wasn't even the interesting part. The interesting part was my grandfather's original language. He had tied that trust to blood descent on purpose, which meant the whole 30-year project of writing me out had been built on sand, because the moment the actual blood was on the table, the only grandchild the trust had ever truly protected, by its own founding words, was me. My mother had spent 3 decades and a great deal of money making everyone believe I was the stranger. And in doing it, she'd overlooked the one document older and stronger than all her scheming. Her father-in-law's certainty that blood was blood. I want to be very clear with you here because this is the part where a lesser version of me could have become the villain of my own story. I could have taken those documents to a lawyer and simply detonated it all through the courts. Quiet, brutal, final. I could have taken everything from Vivian and Danielle who, and I sat with this for a long time, did not choose any of it. They didn't know. They grew up believing Gerald was their father as completely as I grew up believing I was the one who didn't belong. They were cruel to me, yes. They laughed on cue, but they were also underneath it. 2 more people my mother had lied to their entire lives. So I made a decision, driving to that reunion that I want you to hold on to. I decided that I was not going to do what was done to me. I was not going to erase anyone, but I was also, finally, done being erased. Those 2 things could both be true. I was going to bring the truth into the light in front of the whole family and let it be seen, not as a knife, but as a fact. And then I was going to let everyone, including my father, decide who they wanted to be once they could actually see. The reunion was the second Saturday in July. 90 degrees, a tent on the lawn, my mother in a linen dress directing caterers like a general. Cousins I hadn't seen in years, aunts and uncles. Nana Ruth in the good chair in the shade, watching everything with her pale eyes, and me pushing her lemonade because it was too hot for her to be up. My father in a short-sleeved shirt, flipping burgers he wasn't supposed to eat, 65 years old and beaming, the happiest I'd seen him in a decade, surrounded by his family. I almost didn't do it. I want you to know that. Watching him laugh, I almost took those 3 documents out of my bag and drove home and let the lie stand, because the lie made that man happy and the truth was going to break his heart. I stood at the edge of the tent with my hand on my bag and I nearly walked away. And then my mother did what my mother always did. As the sun dropped and the heat let go, we all moved inside for the birthday dinner. The long table in the dining room, set for the whole family, candles, the good plates. Nana was settled into the armchair in the den, just off the dining room, where she could hear everything without being up in the crush. My mother had arranged the evening down to the minute, and part of it, because she was smart and because she decided the safest way to bury the DNA activity was to control it rather than cancel it. Part of it was a little family heritage moment. She'd taken my idea, the one she'd tried to kill, and she'd repackaged it as her own, sanded down to something harmless. Vivian stood up with her phone and her results, the ones she'd already posted, and started reading out the fun parts. 22% this, 18% that. A laugh about a great-great-grandmother from a country none of us had ever visited. Passing her phone down the table so everyone could see the pretty map. My mother beaming, thinking she'd defanged it, thinking she'd turned the bomb into a party favor. And I understood that she had just, with her own hands, set the table for me. Because the results were already in the system. And the system doesn't just show you a map. I'd learned that at my own kitchen table 8 days before. If you scroll past the pretty graphics, past the percentages, it shows you your relatives. It shows you, in a number, exactly how you're tied to every other person in that database who shares your blood. Vivian's phone was going down the table, hand to hand, so everyone could ooh at her map. And Vivian, who never read the fine print, who never in her life scrolled to the part that mattered, had no idea what was sitting 3 taps below the graphic she was so proud of. I watched the phone move down the table, past a cousin, past an aunt, and I did the one active thing I did that whole afternoon, the small cold thing. The thing my mother never saw coming because she was too busy watching my face stay still. As the phone came near me, I leaned toward my father who loved gadgets, who was proud of his girls, who was having the best day he'd had in years. And I said, warm as anything, "Dad, you have to see Vivian's relatives list. It shows how everyone's connected. Scroll down past the map. It's the neatest part." And I handed my father his daughter's phone, and I told him where to look. He put on his reading glasses. The whole table was still laughing about the great-great-grandmother. My mother was pouring wine for an aunt, her back half-turned, relaxed for the first time all summer, certain she had won. My father scrolled down past the map, and I watched him find the number. I have replayed the next 10 seconds more times than I can count. My father read the screen. His smile didn't vanish all at once. That's not how it happens. It faded in stages, like he was reading a sentence he understood one word at a time, and each word took something out of him. The laughter about the great-great-grandmother went on around him. Vivian was still talking. My mother was still pouring wine. And my father sat at the head of his own birthday table and went gray, the exact gray of the tablecloth, his thumb frozen on his daughter's phone. He looked up, not at my mother, not at Vivian. He looked at me. And in that look was the whole thing. The question and the answer to the question and the understanding that I had known and had chosen this moment and had handed him the phone on purpose. He looked at me for a long second, and I did not look away because I was done looking away. Then he set the phone down very carefully, face down, like it was something that might go off. And in a voice I had never heard from him, low and even and terrible in its calm, he said, "I need everyone to step outside for a minute." The table didn't understand. Somebody laughed, thinking it was a joke, a birthday boy speech coming. My mother turned from the wine, and I watched her face read his face, and I watched 30 years of vigilance snap back into her body all at once. She said, "Gerald, what?" "Outside," he said. "All of you, give me the room, please." And then, because he was a careful man too, because that's where I got it, he added the words that I will hear in my head for the rest of my life. He looked around that table full of the family he had spent his whole life providing for, and he said, everyone but Camille." You could have heard a pin drop on the lawn. My mother did not move. Her eyes went from him to the face-down phone to me, and I watched her do the arithmetic she'd been doing my whole life, faster than anyone, and I watched her arrive at the answer and understand, for the first time in 30 years, that she had lost control of the room. "Camille," she said, and my name came out of her like a warning and a plea at the same time. "Whatever you think you—" "Patricia." My father did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. That was the terrible part. Outside. They went. All of them. The cousins baffled, the aunts whispering, Vivian throwing me a look of pure venom because even now, even here, her instinct was that I had ruined something. Danielle, confused, herding people toward the door. And my mother, last of all, walking backward almost, her eyes on me the entire way, until the door closed and it was just my father and me and the wreckage of a birthday dinner on a long table. He didn't ask me if it was true. He was too smart for that, and he'd already seen the number. He said, "How long have you known?" So I told him. Not all of it. Not standing there. I told him about the number on the phone, the one that said half. I reached into my bag and I took out the folder, and I want you to know my hands were steady, because I had decided days before that when this moment came, I would not deliver it the way it had always been delivered to me, in cruelty with a laugh. I would deliver it the way I deliver the hardest truths to the frightened people in my office. Gently, completely, with the paper right there so no one has to just take my word. I laid the first page in front of him, the relatives list, Vivian and me, half. I explained what it meant in plain words, the way I do for a living, that two children of the same mother and father share a certain amount, and that Vivian and I did not, and that the only explanation the numbers allowed was that we shared her and not him. He looked at it for a long time, and then this man, this proud, careful man, put his face in his hands at the head of his own table, and his shoulders shook once, hard, silent. I put my hand on his back, 30 years of no one's hand on my shoulder, and the first shoulder I ever got to hold was his. When he lifted his head, his eyes were wet, but his voice was flint. "The other one," he said. "Danielle." Not a question. He already knew, but he needed it said. I told him Danielle hadn't tested, but I told him about Nana, about being held as a newborn, about a chest going cold twice and warm once. I told him about 7 years ago, the kidney workup, the marker on his own page that couldn't have made either of them, the grid I'd drawn at my kitchen table and folded up and hidden from myself because I was afraid. He listened to all of it without a word, and then I laid down the second page, the spreadsheet, the money. I said, "There's more, Dad, and I need you to hear it when you're steady, because it's the part that isn't an accident." And I walked him through it. The tuition that went somewhere else, the taxes on a house that wasn't ours, the name on a deed, the total at the bottom. 30 years of the money he broke his body earning, steered quietly toward keeping a secret alive. And then I laid down the third page, the amendment, the trust, My name absent. The line. Chosen a separate path. Shown little connection. She had you sign this 18 months ago, I said. It cuts me out completely. Her father's trust, your father's, was written for blood. She spent my whole life making everyone believe I was the one who didn't belong, so that when it came time to divide what's yours, no one would blink when I got nothing. I kept my voice level. She didn't do it because I was different, Dad. She did it because I was the proof. I'm the only one you can be sure of. The door opened. My mother could not stand it any longer. Of course she couldn't, standing on that lawn, watching the minutes she couldn't control tick by. She came back in, and behind her Vivian and Danielle, drawn by the gravity of it. And my mother looked at the 3 pages spread across the table and at my father's gray face. And she did the thing she had done my whole life. She reached for the story. Gerald, she has always been jealous of the girls, she said, fast, smooth, the words already assembled. She's twisting something, some computer error. You know how these things. Patricia. My father stood up. He picked up the first page, the relatives list, and he held it out to her, not shaking it, just holding it in the air between them. Explain this number to me. And here's the thing about my mother that I finally understood in that moment. She had built her entire life on being the one who spoke last, who framed every story, who could always explain. And a number cannot be explained away. It doesn't have feelings you can work on. It doesn't want your approval. It just sits there being true. She opened her mouth. She looked at the page. She looked at Vivian, and something crossed her face. Not guilt, exactly. Calculation, running out of road. She said, "That's not..." And then she stopped. Because the only sentences available to her all began with an admission, and she had spent 30 years making sure she'd never have to say a single one of them out loud. Nobody rescued her. There was no lawyer at the door, no long-lost letter, no villain's confession. There was just a woman standing in a dining room with 3 pieces of paper in front of her, and a family finally looking at her with the clear eyes Nana Ruth had promised someone finally would. And it was Vivian who broke it. Vivian who had picked up the 2nd page while my mother floundered the money, and then the 3rd, the amendment. Vivian who had spent her whole life as the favorite and had never once had to read the fine print, reading it now. She looked up, and for the first time in my life, I saw my oldest sister's face without its armor. "Mom," she said, and her voice cracked down the middle like a child's. "Whose house is this? On this deed, whose name is this?" My mother didn't answer. And in that silence, that long, awful, ringing silence, everyone in that room finally heard the same thing at the same time. The truth my mother had spent 3 decades and a fortune making sure no one would ever hear. My father set the page down on the table, and then he did something I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for. He did not turn his anger on Vivian and Danielle. He looked at his 2 oldest daughters, the 2 who had laughed on cue at me for 30 years, the 2 who had just learned in a single afternoon that the man they called Dad was not their father. And whatever was breaking in his chest, he set it down long enough to see that they were breaking too. "This is not your fault," he said to them, rough and quiet. "You hear me? Neither of you did this. You were lied to, just like I was." Danielle was crying. Vivian was staring at the deed in her hand like it might change if she looked hard enough. And my father, 65 years old on the worst birthday of his life, gave his 2 shattered daughters the one thing my mother had never given me. He told them the truth, and then he told them it wasn't their sin to carry. Then he turned to my mother, and I braced for the explosion, the one I'd braced for my whole childhood. It didn't come. That's not who he was. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said so quietly I almost didn't hear it. 30 years, Patricia. You let them laugh at her. You wrote her out. You let me believe I had a daughter who didn't care about her own family. His voice caught just once. She's the only one who ever did. My mother tried one more time because trying was the only muscle she had. Gerald, I did it for the girls. Everything I did was to protect this. Don't. He didn't shout it. He just closed his eyes. Don't tell me it was for anyone but you. There's a total on that spreadsheet, Patricia. I earned every dollar of it. I know exactly who it was for. And that was the end of my mother's reign. Not with a scream, not with a confession, not with her being dragged out. Just a man too tired to be lied to anymore, closing his eyes, and a room full of people who could finally see. She stood there in her linen dress in the wreckage of the party she'd planned to the minute, and for the first time in my life she had absolutely nothing to say, because the only true sentences left all started with "I did," and she would rather have died than say them. She left. She gathered her purse with shaking hands, and she walked out through the tent and the caterers and the confused cousins on the lawn, and she drove away from her husband's 65th birthday. And the strange thing is that no one tried to stop her. There was nothing to stop. The thing that had held us all in its grip for 3 decades had just evaporated in the space of 10 minutes, the way fog does when the sun finally hits it. I need to tell you about Nana. In all of it, I had forgotten she was in the next room, in the good chair, too frail to be up in the heat. When the noise died down, I went to her. She was sitting exactly where I'd left her, her pale eyes bright, and she had heard every word through the doorway. She reached up and took my hand in both of hers, the way she had by the drinks table 4 years before, and she said, "There she is." Just that. There she is. Like she'd been waiting my whole life for me to show up, and I finally had. I want to stop here and talk to you, because I know some of you have been holding your breath for a while now, and I know why. If you're listening to this and you recognize it, if you've ever been the one written out, the one they said didn't care, the one whose absence from the family photo was somehow always your own fault, I want you to hear the one thing I learned in that dining room. The truth does not need you to be loud. It does not need you to be cruel. It does not even need you to win. It just needs to be brought into the light where people can finally see it, and then it does the rest by itself. Because a fact is the one thing in this world that does not care whether you approve of it. So if you've been carrying a folded up truth in the back of your mind because you were afraid of what looking at it would make you, this is your reminder that you are allowed to unfold it. Take a breath with me. And if this story is doing something to you right now, tell me in the comments what it's stirring up, because I promise you are not the only one who was ever called the one who didn't belong, who... Now let me tell you how it actually ended, because the reveal was not the end. The reveal is never the end. What you do after is. Here is what I did not do after. I did not take everyone to court. I did not use those 3 pieces of paper to strip Vivian and Danielle of everything and walk away with it all, even though the estate attorney had made it clear I could have tried. I thought about it. I won't pretend I didn't. There's a version of me, a version that 30 years of that house had every right to create, who would have burned it all down and salted the earth. For about a week, I wanted to be her. But then I thought about a chest going cold over a newborn who never did anything wrong except be born into a lie. Vivian and Danielle were cruel to me, and I am not going to sit here and tell you all was forgiven, because that's not honest and you'd know it. But they were also 2 women who had just lost their father in an afternoon, because whatever the blood said, Gerald had raised them, and now every memory they had was cut with a lie our mother told. I knew exactly what it felt like to be a child made into a stranger by Patricia Thornton. I was not going to do it to anyone else, not even to the 2 who'd laughed at me. Doing that would have made me the thing she always said I was. And I was finally, at 33, free to be what I actually was instead. The weeks after were quiet in a way my family had never been quiet. My father filed for divorce in August. He was calm about it, methodical, and he asked me to help him understand the paperwork, which is how I ended up sitting across a table from my father going through documents together. The exact thing the amendment had said I had little connection to. We connected just fine. It turns out we speak the same language, he and I. Fine print, careful columns. The two of us reading things all the way to the end. He tore up the amendment first thing. Not literally. You don't tear up a notarized document, you have a lawyer revoke it, and he did within the month. But he told me about it over coffee, and there was something almost shy in the way he said it. Like a man apologizing for a house he'd let someone else decorate badly. "It's gone," he said. "That thing she had me sign, it's gone." And then he looked at me, and he said the sentence I had waited 30 years and never expected to hear. He said, "You were always going to be taken care of. I'm sorry it took me this long to make sure of it. I'm sorry I ever let anyone make me doubt it." I want to be honest about the money because I know you're wondering, and because I think dodging it would be dishonest. My father restructured everything on his own terms with a clear head, and he did it fairly. He did not cut Vivian and Danielle out the way my mother had cut me out. He refused to do to them what had been done to me, and I loved him for that refusal, even when a small part of me flinched at it. He made sure I was restored to the trust my grandfather had built for his blood, and he made his own choices about his own company and his own life for the 2 daughters he had raised, because a father, he told me, is not a blood test. "I raised 3 girls," he said. "I'll leave this world having raised 3 girls. What your mother did doesn't get to take that from me, too." I didn't argue. I understood. Being the one who insists on grace instead of revenge is, it turns out, its own kind of strength, and I'd learned it from watching him that afternoon. My mother I saw once more. She asked to meet me. A coffee shop, neutral ground, her choice. I almost didn't go. But I have learned that the things you refuse to look at are the things that own you. So I went, and I sat across from her. And for the first time in my life, I was not a little girl hoping she'd finally arrange me into the photo. She looked older. She tried for a while the old machinery, that it was complicated, that I'd never understand, that she'd done what she had to do, that a marriage has secrets. And I let her talk, because I am not cruel, and because I wanted to see if anywhere in there was the sentence I'd waited my whole life for. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. You did belong." It never came. What came instead, at the very end, was the truest thing she ever said to me. She looked at me across that little table and she said, "You were always going to be the one who figured it out. That's why I could never stand to look at you." And there it was. 30 years of You're Nothing Like Us, finally translated. She hadn't hated me because I didn't belong. She'd hated me because I did, more than any of them, and I was the one person alive who might one day hold up a mirror the family couldn't lie to. I didn't cry. I'd done my crying. I stood up, and I put money on the table for both our coffees, because I pay my own way, always have, and I said the only thing I had left to say to her. I said, "You spent my whole life telling me I was nothing like you. Thank you. It's the only kind thing you ever gave me." And I left her sitting there, and I did not look back, and I have not spoken to her since. That's the boundary, if you're wondering. That's where I drew it. Not a scream, not a lawsuit, not a scene. Just a grown woman paying for her own coffee and walking out of a story she was never really allowed to be in, into one that was finally hers. Vivian and I are not close. I don't know that we ever will be. But she called me in September, which she had never done in her life without wanting something, and this time she didn't want anything. She just said, "I don't know how to be whatever I am now." And I understood that because I had spent 30 years not knowing how to be whatever I was. So I said the truest thing I knew. I said, "You start by stopping the lying, even the small ones, even to yourself. It's harder than it sounds, and it's the only thing that works." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Thank you," and it sounded like it cost her something. And I think that's the most honest thing my oldest sister has ever given me. Danielle sends me pictures of her kids now. Small things. We are not healed. We are just, for the first time, not lying to each other. Sometimes that's the whole beginning. Nana Ruth turned 89 that October. We had a small party, just a few of us, in the brick house that smells of coffee and old paper. My father came, and he brought a cake he wasn't supposed to eat and ate anyway, and Nana scolded him about it exactly the way she'd scolded me about cold tea my whole life. And I sat there watching the two of them, and I thought, this is it. This is the family. It was smaller than the one under the tent. It was so much larger than anything I'd ever had. At one point, Nana sent me to the back bedroom again, the same oak desk, the same lace curtains, to fetch something, and I stood for a moment in the spot where I'd stood the day the ground broke. The trust folder was long gone from that drawer. It lived with the lawyers now, corrected, made right. But I stood there anyway, and I let myself feel the whole distance between the woman who'd opened that drawer in May and the woman standing there in October. She had not gotten harder. That's what surprised me most. I'd expected to come out the other side of all this with a shell on, finally armored, finally cold. Instead, I felt more like myself than I ever had. The stillness I'd learned as a child, the one that kept my face blank while my mother put me on the end of the photo, I didn't need it anymore. I could feel my own face doing whatever it wanted, and it felt like taking off shoes that had never fit. I brought Nana what she'd asked for. She looked up at me over her hot tea, and she patted the chair beside her, and I sat, and she took my hand. "You know what the worst part was," she said. "It wasn't really a question, so I waited. Watching them do it to you and knowing, all those years, every reunion, every one of her little comments, and me too old and too far outside it to make anyone listen. I used to lie awake wondering if I should just say it, blow the whole thing up myself." She shook her head slowly. "But it wasn't mine to blow up. It was yours, and you had to come to it in your own time, with your own hands, or it wouldn't have held." She squeezed. "I'm just glad I lived to see it. There she is. There she is." Third time she'd said it to me. And I finally understood that all my life, Nana Ruth had been talking to a version of me she could see coming from very far away. The version who would one day stop setting the table and start reading the fine print out loud. She'd been waiting for me at the drinks table. She'd been waiting for me in that drawer. She'd been waiting for me my whole life, and she'd never once doubted I'd arrive. I think about the science of it more than you'd expect. For a living, I sit with people on the hardest days of their lives, and I help them understand what their blood says about them. And the truth I tell them, the one under all the other truths, is this: your DNA is a fact, but it is not a verdict. It tells you where you come from. It does not get to tell you who you are, or who gets to love you, or what family means. My father proved that when he refused to unmake 2 daughters over a test result. A machine gave us a number that said half, and my father looked at that number and chose, on purpose, to keep loving the whole. But there's a flip side to that truth, and my mother is the proof of it. Because for 30 years, she used the idea of blood as a weapon. She made belonging a thing you could be exiled from, a card she got to play, a photo she got to arrange with you on the end. And the cruelest part, the part I've made a kind of peace with, is that the whole time, the blood she was so afraid of was mine. I was the one who belonged the most. I was the proof she couldn't stand to look at. She spent a fortune and 3 decades and her entire marriage making sure no one would ever see it. And in the end, all it took to bring it into the light was a $40 kit, an old woman who never stopped believing in me, and a daughter finally willing to unfold the thing she'd been hiding from herself. People ask me, when I tell this, the few people I've told, whether I regret it, whether I'd take it back, unsend the kits, let my father keep his happy lie and his happy birthday. And I understand why they ask. He was happy that afternoon. He was gray and broken by nightfall. There are days I feel the weight of that. But then I think about who I was before and who he is now. Before, I was a grown woman still setting a perfect table, still hoping. And my father was a man being quietly robbed by the person closest to him, loving people who'd been kept from ever really knowing him, signing away his one true daughter because he'd been told, gently and constantly, that she didn't care. The lie was comfortable. It was also a cage, and all 5 of us were in it, and only one of us could see the bars. So no, I don't regret it. The truth cost us the comfortable version of our family. It gave us, in exchange, a real one. Smaller, quieter, honest, built out of the people who could stand to live in the light. My father, who reads the fine print with me on Sunday afternoons now, Nana, who saw me coming my whole life, even Vivian, learning in her 40s how to stop lying, one hard phone call at a time. For 30 years, my family called me the one who didn't belong. My mother said it so many times that I very nearly built my whole life around believing her. And it turned out to be the biggest lie in a house full of them. Because I wasn't the stranger at that table. I was the only one who was ever really, completely home. They just needed me to believe I wasn't, so they could keep me from noticing that I was the one holding the key the whole time. I don't set the table at family gatherings anymore. My father does that now. Badly, forks in the wrong places, and nobody corrects him, because it turns out the point was never the forks. I just show up. I show up as myself, with my own face doing whatever it wants, and I sit down wherever I like. Never on the end.